Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Neolithic India, and we're going to move into kind of the foundations of that civilization. Next week, we're going to talk about some of the religious beliefs of ancient India. So this is the perfect time to kind of talk about the foundation, the political and agricultural foundations of that society. So in the first video, I had briefly talked about the Neolithic New Stone Age, right? The rise of agriculture, which enabled huge population concentrations that human beings had never seen before. Usually, people lived in bands of 12 to 20 people as hunter-gatherers, all of whom were somewhat related to one another, and they didn't live in more complex social organizations. With the rise of agriculture, you could feed many more people per acre. Suddenly you could have a much higher population density, and we start to see the rise of the first cities and the rise of the first complex social organizations. So Neolithic, it means New Stone Age. The Paleolithic is the Old Stone Age. The separating factor is that human beings had agriculture in the New Stone Age. They still had tools of stone, wood, bone, antler, etc., but now they were farming, whereas before they were having to follow around herds of animals. So people stayed in one place, they built cities, and for the first time, human beings were able to diversify their labor. Right? You didn't have to have everyone concerned with obtaining food at all times, right? You could have people who specialized in other tasks, like metalworking. Eventually, technological changes and the advent of writing would be the result of agriculture. Right? The foundation of civilization anywhere in the world is agriculture. Um, in the case of ancient India, that would be millet, barley, and rice agriculture, which would depend on the monsoon. So it's in the early river valleys that it's in the fertile river valleys that civilization begins. The reason for this is that the soil is perfect for growing. So with primitive agricultural techniques, people could grow large amounts of food and prosper. The problem is that these rivers, whether it's the Nile or the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's now Iraq, or the Indus River Valley in Pakistan and India, or the Yellow River in China, right? These rivers flooded, and they could often be very catastrophic when it came to their flooding. So uh, there was an impetus for these early societies to maximize their yields and also to control these floods. So you have these huge earthworks of irrigation ditches stretching for miles, big dams made of rocks and wood to try to block out the flow of water in certain areas and to control the movement of water. And these were very, very labor intensive, and they required a lot of social organization. And to a certain extent, they required coercion. You had to have rulers with the authority and the power necessary to to maintain these structures. If they weren't maintained, it would mean disaster and ultimately famine. Many more people could be fed in this agricultural system than could be fed by hunting and gathering. The problem was that this new system was much more vulnerable. So we're looking at civilization developing in the Indus River Valley around 7,000 years ago. First millet, and then barley, and then rice. The ancient Indus River Valley civilization is the foundational setting for what we call Indian civilization, meaning the entire subcontinent. The country of India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and also Afghanistan and Myanmar to a certain extent. So you have the rise of these cities on the Indus River Valley floodplain, and the sites exist in both Pakistan and India. That division is a modern creation and wasn't present in this period of time. And these cities all were based around millet and later rice agriculture. So you had to have large numbers of people working together to maintain these flood control systems, to maintain these agricultural systems. unlike some of the other urban developments in other parts of the world, these cities were all centrally planned. They were very, very well organized. They were mathematically organized. In fact, one of the strengths of ancient Indian civilization was an emphasis on mathematics. Right? It's not a coincidence that ancient Indian civilization, that this was the civilization that developed the number zero, right? Which it seems counterintuitive, but there wasn't always a zero, right? In Roman numerals, there is no zero, for example. Um, in ancient India, the idea of zero developed, and it made math much, much easier. It allowed for the 10-based math system that we have now. In fact, what we call Arabic numerals, modern numbers that are used throughout the world, originated in India. We call them Arabic numerals because they came into Europe and ultimately into the homeland and the origin point of English, the English language, via Arabs. So the Indians were very advanced mathematically, astronomically, very early on. We know that their religious beliefs centered around ritualistic bathing. They had very large baths in the center of their cities, and we know that a huge amount of energy from their religious culture went into to maintaining these baths and into individuals bathing in certain rituals. We also know that they had a relatively stringent form of social hierarchy, possibly even the origins of the caste system, which we'll talk about later on when we talk about Hinduism in detail. The idea of people being born into different ranks or castes, and their moral code and their duty in life being different based on what caste they are. We know that lower caste individuals were only allowed to bathe in certain pools, while ordinary citizens were allowed to bathe in certain pools, and then elites were allowed to bathe in the big pools near the palace and temple complexes that were at the height of these cities. We also know that these ancient cultures revered cattle. And you can see here this image from Mohenjo-Daro, an ancient Indus River Valley city, where an ancient breed of cattle, you can see how big the horns are, right? This is relatively close to the auroch, the ancestor of all modern cattle, which were much more aggressive, much more difficult to maintain, right? But they existed in the ancient Indus River Valley. And this script here that you see above has never been deciphered. Archaeologists have never been able to translate it. One day they may be able to translate it. If they do, we will learn a great deal about this civilization that we don't currently know. One of the major sites of the Indus River Valley is the site of Harappa. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are the two big cities, the kind of New York and Los Angeles of the Indus River Valley, right? Or the New York and Chicago. We know that at Harappa, on the outskirts of Harappa, we see cotton cultivated for the first time. This would have a tremendous impact on the development of India. It would even have an impact on America. One of the reasons that the Confederacy was unable to win over European support during the American Civil War was the fact that the British began to cultivate cotton in India, right? So they no longer needed the American South for cotton for their textile mills, which cut out a major bargaining chip that the Confederates were using to try to win the British over to supporting them militarily in the American Civil War. So in ancient India, cotton was cultivated first and was cultivated most thoroughly there throughout antiquity. We saw, already talked about the prevalence of cattle. They had very large cockfights, which is something that you see in much of the world, very, very popular in ancient China. Usually these, certainly in Chinese cockfighting, in ancient Chinese cockfighting, the talons of the roosters could actually be equipped with blades to make them even more deadly. Very, very brutal game. but one that was popular at the time. We know that Harappa was destroyed, and we know that about 15% of the male skeletons there died violently. Right? Some type of trauma was used to end the lives of a large portion of the male population. And one thing about that is that seems like a lot, 15%, and it is a lot. But for hunter-gatherers, usually about 1 out of 3 men were thought to have died violently due to the fact of competition and warfare between groups. And that's a pattern that we've seen in bones. We've also observed it in hunting and gathering communities in the 20th century, right? In the Amazonian rainforest, in parts of Papua New Guinea, about 1 out of 3 men being killed, whether through warfare or through ritualistic combat over marriages, etc., it being very, very common for particularly young men to die as a result of wounds. So the second great city was Mohenjo-Daro. You can see here this big pool that was used for ritualistic bathing. And this is a very ancient city built around 2500 BC, abandoned by 1900 BC. We don't really know why the Indus River Valley was abandoned. Some people think that there was a great environmental disaster. Right? One of the reasons for this is that we found that there was a great amount of soil erosion in the Indus River Valley, right, in the floodplain. When farmers would farm, before we understood crop rotation, putting nutrients back in the soil by planting certain crops, allowing fields to recover by remaining fallow without crops. That's what that means. And we knew about planting trees to stop soil erosion. Erosion could be a major source of tragedy for human populations. In fact, I mean, all the way into the 1930s with the Dust Bowl in Texas and Kansas and Nebraska, you had dust storms that went as far as Washington, D.C., that originated on the Great Plains because there had been so much farming and so many trees had been cut down and there was nothing to hold the earth in place. Well, the same kind of thing happened in the Indus River Valley. We know that they cleared vast amounts of forest, and this deforestation created very loose soil, and that the end result was a massive amount of erosion, in part due to the monsoon. And the monsoon comes in, and instead of kicking up silt from the riverbed onto the land, it takes the silt that's already on the land and blows it 200 miles away, right? Scatters it to the winds, right? Literally. So we know that these civilizations died out, were ultimately abandoned, and much of the population moved further to the east to the Ganges River plain. And it's speculated that it was due to the collapse of the agricultural system. But there were remnants in the Indus River Valley, and these remnants of this great civilization struggled to fend off a very large invasion that they ultimately were unsuccessful in defeating from a group of people called the Aryans. And I use this term, we're talking about a very specific group of people. We're not talking about what is represented by the modern use of this term, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Why this term was used, why it has nothing to do really with what we're talking about here. We're talking about a specific tribe of people that came from somewhere in southern Russia that moved through Iran. The name Iran is derived from Aryan, right? The word Arya is an ancient Indo-European word meaning noble. Iran and Ireland are both based off this word. These are very different societies, don't have much in common, but we'll talk about what they do have in common and where that and what this means more in a moment. But this tribe of Aryans moved through Iran and Afghanistan into the Indus River Valley, and they began to subjugate the remnants of the Indus River Valley civilization. So these Aryans who moved in were very warlike. They had domesticated the horse. They were the first people to domesticate the horse, and this gave them tremendous military power for obvious reasons. They generally preferred for their elites to fight from chariots. You have these big chariots drawn by teams of horses, and they were very fast, especially on flat, level ground, like a floodplain, and they could be absolutely devastating. You would have a driver, usually a lancer with a spear, who would spear or wield a sword or mace at enemies, and then you would have an archer who would shoot or throw javelins at enemies from a distance, and they would circle around and attack with a ranged weapon. And then when the enemy was finally worn down, they would charge fully into them and run them over. So it was the Aryans who they combined the religion of the Indus River Valley civilization, its emphasis on cattle, um, potentially its worship of cattle, and its emphasis on bathing, and combined that with their own pantheon of gods and goddesses, which laid the foundation for Hinduism. This isn't just a phenomenon that concerns India. It concerns many parts of the Old World. In fact, Europe is the continent most affected by the what we call the Indo-European migration. The Aryans were one tribe of Indo-Europeans who originated in southern Russia and southeastern Ukraine, and they're also called the Yamnaya. Right? The Indo-Europeans are also called the Yamnaya. Some of them moved west and splintered into different groups. The Germanic language speakers, the Italic language speakers, like the Romans, the Greek speakers, like the Dorian Greeks, the Celtic peoples, like the Irish, Scottish, etc., and moved into different parts of Europe. Some of them went east and conquered what's now Iran. They would become the Persians, the Persian group of cultures who spoke Persian languages. You had peoples called the Hittites who lived in what's now Asia Minor, and you had the Aryans who moved east into India. All of these groups were related at one point. Right? They all at one point spoke a common language called Indo-European. And we use the term Indo-European because the speakers of this ancient language stretched from India into Europe. Right? But well, I'll talk more as we move forward. So we're looking at a language family. You can see in blue here the peoples whose dominant languages are Indo-European, right? That's most of Europe, right, with the exception of the Basque Country in Spain, Iran, right? And Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern India. And of course, you have Australia here through colonization, New Zealand, and South Africa here also through colonization, much later than in the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries. But so these languages are all related. They're part of language families, meaning that all of these languages stem from a common ancestor. Right? So at some point there were people called the Yamnaya living in southern Russia who spoke a language called Proto-Indo-European, and it was the foundational language for all these other languages. Right? You also have the Afro-Asiatic language family, or what it used to be called the Semitic language family. And all of the Semitic languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ancient Egyptian, the Ethiopian languages like Amharic and Ge'ez, the Berber languages, all have a common ancestor, Proto-Afro-Asiatic or Proto-Semitic, right? So that we can trace those languages back to a common ancestor. Same with the Niger-Congo, or what we call the Bantu languages, right? Same thing with Sino-Tibetan, right? So, for example, you have all the different groups within China. You have the Manchus, you have the Tibetans. They all have a common ancestor, right? And there are some languages that we can't trace back to a common ancestor with another language, like Japanese, right? It's what we call a language isolate. We can't trace its its ancestry back, and that's also the case for a lot of Native American languages. Right? We can't trace them back. But language families are useful because they let us understand the movement of peoples before written records. For example, you look at Madagascar here. It's the same color here as Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. That's because these languages are Austronesian. Right? And in Madagascar, Malagasy, the dominant language of Madagascar, isn't similar to any African languages. It's more similar to the insular Southeast Asian Austronesian languages. We know this through the vocabulary, the way that their grammar is structured, and we know now through both archaeology and linguistic analysis and DNA analysis that large numbers of people sailed across the Indian Ocean in antiquity and settled Madagascar. In fact, most of Madagascar was first settled by sailors from these islands, right? Not from the continent of Africa, right? So from the mainland, right? So there is a common link there. And with people in northern India, Iran, Europe, virtually everywhere in Europe, we can trace these groups back to southern Russia, and that includes the ancestors of the Romans, the Greeks, the Celts, the Germanic, all the subgroups of the Germanics, like the Anglo-Saxons, the Norse, right? This is a useful tool in understanding the movement of peoples in antiquity, but it isn't a race like it was treated as in the 19th and early 20th centuries. What had happened is that as Germany unified in the late 19th century, you had a lot of people coming out of Germany who were great intellectuals. And Germany was a major powerhouse for academia, for history, for anthropology, for linguistics particularly, but also the natural sciences, industrial development. I mean, Germany was an outsized player in the world. And so what had happened is, because there are linguistic similarities between Germanic languages like German, Danish, English is a Germanic language, Norwegian, Swedish, and, Romance languages deriving from Latin like French, Spanish, Italian, right? That there is an origin point for all these different groups of people. Well, the German philosophers, many of them, and sociologists thought, well, if there has to have been a common origin between all these different peoples in Europe, but they had to be like us. They had to be like Germans, right? The Germans are the purest Indo-Europeans. So they took their own German identity and pushed it back on these very, very ancient people who didn't really resemble modern Germans and we're going so far back that the idea of even Germanic languages hadn't even existed yet. In fact, when we look at the graves of people in southern Russia, the Yamnaya, we look at their physical features, they are Eurasian in appearance, meaning that they're kind of a fusion of what we would now call Europeans and East Asians in terms of how they looked. Right? And this is going back very, very far in time. So they didn't represent any kind of German ideal, but the word was co-opted to become synonymous with German because some of these anthropologists argued that the Germans were the purest form of the ancient Indo-Europeans. And they believed that at one point, all of the Indo-Europeans who were essentially Germanic in appearance and culture, and that they were diluted by mixing with different groups of people in other parts of the world, which is why they chose the swastika as the symbol for Nazi Germany, for example. It was originally a Hindu symbol, right, coming out of India. But because from the Nazi point of view, India was the first Aryan civilization that was later destroyed through mixing of different bloodlines, right? This is their ideology, it's not the truth, right? But they took that symbol, that ancient Indian symbol, as their own. In reality, all of these different groups, people in North India, Iran, Germany, Britain, France, Spain, Norway, Russia. They are all equally close and distant from the ancient Yamnaya, right? Uh, the, because they're all descendants, modern day descendants of the same people, right? But the ancient Yamnaya uh, did not resemble modern Europeans. You can see elements of modern Europeans in their appearance, but they also they resembled people from East Asia also, right? So they're their own distinct group. Um, and it was these tribesmen who invaded northern India, and I just wanted to clear that up, right? Because when we're talking about the Aryans, we're not talking about anything to do with any kind of 19th, 20th century racial classification, right? We're talking about an ancient group that is so far back in time that it's largely uh, independent of that. Even, there is a connection between modern Germans and Indo-Europeans, absolutely. Uh, 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 but it's so far back that, uh, you know, you go back far enough, you can find a link between any two groups of people, right? Because all human beings originated from one location. At least that's the prevailing theory. All right, so um, so the Aryans conquered northern India. They gradually subjugated the remnants of the Indus Valley civilization, and they created a new civilization with distinct caste differences. Now, of course, they're creating a highly stratified society. They're going to place themselves at the top. They're the conquerors. They're the nobility. And at the bottom, you have the people they conquered. Over time, due to the mixing of different groups, you start to have these different gradations in the populations, and you have economics affecting it, the development of caste. This is something that exists over centuries, over millennia, right? So again, just to talk about uh, the ancient Indo-Europeans, the ancient Yamnaya. They're very warlike, and they were able to spread over so much of the old world due to their mastery of chariots, chariot warfare, and it made them distinct. It made them very strong. In fact, if you look at the DNA of many groups of people from India all the way to Western Europe, you'll find that most groups of people, it's their patrilineal DNA that is Yamnaya, right? That can be traced back to this group. So, and their matrilineal DNA will be from diverse populations. What that means is that armies of Yamnaya men were going out and conquering large swaths of land with these chariot armies. And they have certain similarities in their religious beliefs. And just to emphasize, how different cultures can be connected. Uh, the ancient Yamnaya, their religious belief was based on a storm god. And they're unique in that the storm god plays a prominent role, if not the dominant role, in their religious pantheon. That's one of the kind of tells that a group of people have Indo-European origins, is that the storm god is very dominant. Um, so you have, for example, uh, Thor in the ancient uh, Norse uh, pantheon. You have Zeus in the ancient Greek pantheon, Jupiter in the ancient Roman pantheon, right? And the same kind of storm god is prevalent in ancient Indian religion. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So the prevalence of a storm god is a kind of a tell that deep in antiquity, uh, this culture got at least part of its origin from the Yamnaya, the Indo-Europeans. Okay, so we call this period the Vedic period, when the Aryans invaded northern India and established their empire there. We call it the Vedic period because of the Vedas. Right? The Vedas are a series of religious poems that were collected by the Aryans, and they recount their uh, religious beliefs. their pantheon of gods and goddesses, but they also, over time, begin to incorporate elements of the pre-Aryan Indus Valley River civilization. For example, they incorporate a reverence for cattle, right? An emphasis on bathing, right? That's very, very prominent. And that when we talk about Hinduism, that will become, in detail, that will become more evident. Right? The Aryans were pastoralists, meaning that they themselves didn't like to stick around and farm. They didn't like to grow crops. They liked to follow very large herds of cattle. They mainly lived off of beef, off of meat, cheese, and also the blood of cattle. And you know, these people were, by ancient standards, had a very high protein diet, which probably contributed to their, um, their prowess in battle, at least their success in war, um, considering the fact that uh, you know the more protein you have access to, generally in antiquity, the taller and more robust you'll be physically. Um, so, and that's not to say that I'm not saying if you're a vegan or something. I'm not talking about anything to do with any kind of modern diet. I'm talking about people who lived, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, completely different kind of technological situation. Um, so during the Vedic era, uh, these tribes form a large kingdom called the Kuru kingdom, and they conquer most of northern India all the way to the Ganges plain, where the last cities of the Indus River Valley civilization have sprung up. They didn't just have chariots, they also used iron tools and weapons. And this was important because with a bronze weapon, right, bronze is a copper and tin alloy, and you can make very high quality weapons out of bronze. The problem is that the copper and tin needed to make bronze is is relatively rare, whereas iron is abundant. And you can make. It's not that the bronze weapons are inferior to iron; they're not. But you can make an iron blade just as sturdy as any bronze blade. Uh, in antiquity, and iron is everywhere. It's abundant. The problem is that you have to have the technology to heat it. You have to be able to get a fire hot enough to smelt iron. Right? Bronze weapons can be made at much lower temperatures. So you start to have a blast furnace. Right? You have to be able to pump oxygen into the furnace with bellows to get the fire hot enough to smelt the iron. Right? But once you can do that, you have easy access to large amounts of weapons. So even a common foot soldier who might have, uh, the remnants of the Indus River Valley civilization, their foot soldiers might have spears, sometimes with even stone points on them, right? Or maybe they might have bronze points on them, just points on the spear. Whereas a, uh, an Aryan warrior could have a spear with an iron spear point, a sword, an iron short sword, possibly a shield, and maybe even a breastplate and helmet, right, made out of iron, which wouldn't have been available to a Bronze Age culture for ordinary foot soldiers, right? Only the nobility could have access to metal armor due to the fact that bronze was much more difficult to mass produce, right, because it was rarer. And virtually every part of the world has large iron deposits. So they had a huge military advantage in terms of their weapons and armor. They had an advantage in terms of their chariots. Also, they had a very warlike culture that encouraged expansion and kind of taking land through domination. So as they move east and south into India, they conquer the different indigenous groups, and they establish their histories as kind of the foundational religious texts for Hinduism. And these religious beliefs, again, are a fusion of their own beliefs with the peoples they conquered. The Vedas are written in Sanskrit, which is an ancient Indo-European language that was very close to kind of a formal version of the language that the Yamnaya spoke. Right? It's one of the world's most ancient written languages, and it's so ancient that generally speaking, the more ancient a language is, well, I won't get into its use in computer programming, but it's used in artificial intelligence, modern computer programming, due to the fact that it's very logically structured, right? And it doesn't have as many near as many words as, say, English, right? French. So there are two great Vedic texts from this period of time, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Now, the Mahabharata is kind of a big poem about a civil war between these different Aryan warriors. You can see one of them here, Arjuna, who is a great warrior of the Aryans, and he's involved in a civil war. And he's upset because he has to fight his relatives and friends and people he's very fond of. And he prays to the god Krishna. And we'll talk more about this when we cover Hinduism next week. And Krishna gives him advice on how to proceed. And this is one of the foundational texts of Hinduism. And there's also the Ramayana, which is a kind of an account of the warrior hero Ram, who ends up befriending this kind of simian god, kind of a monkey god named Hanuman, and they end up traveling all the way south to Sri Lanka in this like epic adventure where there's lots of battles and deeper religious truths discussed within the text. And we're going to talk more about that when we talk about Hinduism. I just wanted to provide a brief survey of ancient India so we knew about the circumstances in which this religious system was created. All right, well, thank you for listening.